Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rob Andrew. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer and former Army officer, currently an adjunct instructor here at the University of Oklahoma at the College of International Studies. I'm here today, and we are here today to discuss the Ukraine-Russia crisis and hopefully understand how we got here a little bit better. My love affair, and I'll use air quotes in this case, my love affair with all things Soviet Russian began in 1980 when I was in the 7th grade. And I had a report to do on any country. I chose the Soviet Union because I had heard that the Russians wanted to nuke us. And I wanted to find out more, in the words of a 7th grader at the time, right? So as part of the assignment, I wrote to the Soviet consulate in San Francisco at the time and requested more information on the Soviet Union and wondered why the Russians wanted to kill us and be our enemy. The day that I received that propaganda packet from them, I was hooked to learn more. I still have it, in fact. I didn't bring it with me today. So that's a bit of my introduction there. What I want to do is, if we can look at this first slide here for a moment. This is the flyer. And we're going to look again at some symbolism here that I put on this table here and on the flyer. But what I want to do is see is there anything wrong with the flyer? Can anybody tell me? Yes. Which flag? That's right. It's upside down. And now when I first did this, it was not on purpose and I was going to fix it. But then I decided, let's leave it that way, because what does it generally mean when you flip a flag upside down? What does it mean? Distress. So there's no doubt about it. Ukraine is in distress today. Has been in distress for at least 8 years. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's, thank you. You get an A for the class today. Well done. So now this is truly the beginning of my, my presentation here. The Ukraine-Russia crisis, how did we get here? It would be a lie if I said that I understand Russia. I probably just know enough to be dangerous. I did do a tour there in the Foreign Service for a couple of years in 2005 to 2007. And it's been my love affair, so to speak, with Russia ever since. But if I were to tell you that I understand Russia, that wouldn't be quite right. The Ukraine issue has, in reality, been smoldering for years. But as we will discuss a bit later, this is not just about Ukraine. With over 100,000 and maybe 150, that's the number that I heard the president use yesterday, Russian troops surrounding Ukraine, the uglier ghosts of the Cold War seem to be raising their heads and demanding that history is indeed not over. The latest unpleasantness over Ukraine most recently started not quite a year ago in April, May of last year. In 2021, with several tens of thousands of Russian troops deployed near Ukraine. But it was not too worrisome, and Vladimir Putin won a concession by having a summit with President Biden in June of 2021 in Geneva. It seemed like the crisis du jour was over. Since October, November of late last year, and especially in December and in the last month or so, we've seen a far more serious buildup of Russian troops, estimated to be well over 100,000, now positioned strategically around Ukraine. I have a map kind of showing that here in a few moments, including from potential launching points in Belarus, which are not that far from the capital, Kyiv. Let's take a quick look at this slide, though. Notice the symbolism in the slide. The flag is correct here. Ukraine in the middle, crossroads of Europe, with inclinations to complete its journey to the west via closer economic cooperation with the EU, which is what got the party started in 2014, I might add. We'll go into that a little bit more later. And then the possibility of NATO membership. Remember, it was the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, where NATO stated that, quote, I'll read from this here for a moment, excuse me. NATO stated that NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. And here's the key sentence. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO, period. no time frame, no offer of when MAP, the membership application process, might begin, no specific timeline. Russia essentially invaded by, Russia responded by invading Georgia. Russia has now demanded that Ukraine never join NATO, and NATO should roll back to 1997 positions. What does Ukraine do? What does Russia want, and why do they care? Why now? How indeed did we get here? I like cartoons. So in this cartoon here, this is actually dated from 2014, from the time when Ukraine was leaning west towards the EU, doing a little bit more integration with an association agreement. And when then President Yanukovych, instead of turning to the EU, said, no, we're going to stop that process. We're going to turn back towards Russia. And you had the Maidan protests in late 2013 and early 2014, which eventually led to the ouster of then President Yanukovych of Ukraine. And Russia responded by annexing Crimea and occupying eastern Ukraine. And if you truly believe that there's no Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, you've really been fooled. Some things to consider. It's kind of an agenda on how I'm going to tackle the rest of today's talk. This is a topic that we really need to handle with care. Potential paths can lead to nuclear annihilation. This isn't hyperbole. This is the truth. This is the kind of thing where if the United States and Russia start trading shots, escalation could be difficult to stop. This is why this is such an important issue. We're going to talk a little bit about Ukraine's geopolitical history in Europe and key dates in history. We're going to look at the Russian military encirclement of Ukraine, the current encirclement. We're also going to take a Russian perspective. And I want you to put your mind in a Russian set of shoes, or at least Putin's set of shoes. Why does Russia care? What the heck does Putin want? No one knows except him, by the way. Anything that I say is really meaningless. Let's call him up. Why now? And some further thoughts that I have. This is really how we want to resolve this. Of course, this is a picture on the left of our current Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and on the right, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's been in the position for a long time. But this is how we want to resolve it, diplomatically. We'd rather avoid this, right? We'd rather avoid a military conflict. We'd rather avoid upwards of 100,000 casualties in a Russian war in Ukraine. These are conservative estimates of what might happen. And we certainly want to avoid that. Let's take a look at the map. This is what Europe looks like now. We are going to talk about NATO expansion a little bit later. But if you look at this map here, you can see where Ukraine is here in the center. Let's see if I might even have my handy dandy pointer. See if it works here. So Ukraine, right? Belarus. This is really all that's left of the old Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc dividing East and West. Now, some people forget about this little thing that's wedged into here, Kaliningrad. That's actually Russian territory. To my A students out here, what terrain did that used to be? Who did that used to belong to? East Prussia. Yeah, Germany, essentially, right? So this was an area that was never going to be German again, according to the Russians. Of course, we have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic countries here, formerly part of the Soviet Union, which, by the way, the United States never recognized when they were absorbed in 1940. Right. You can see Ukraine's position, unique, as well as Belarus. Russians often talk about having buffer states in between it and the West. So those are the only ones that remain from a Russian point of view. Let's look at some key dates since we're talking about Ukraine. There's so much that gets bandied about that we need to be clear about a few things. Yes, there was a treaty of friendship. Yes, there's this union that occurred in the middle of the 17th century, right? But this wasn't just about Ukraine wanting Russia or joining Russia out of the goodness of its heart. It was a pragmatic move. This was getting out from underneath the yoke of Poland and allying with Russia. So it was useful. This was a useful tool. You wonder now if Ukrainians think, maybe that wasn't such a good thing. But nevertheless, Ukrainians and Russians do share similar ethnic, linguistic, cultural background. Ukrainians are married to Russians. Russians are married to Ukrainians. So there's always an aspect of truth of the propaganda that you hear coming out of the Kremlin. It's just how it is spun that you need to pay attention to. Let's come into more modern times. It was because of Ukraine and Belarus and Russia, when those three countries agreed under Boris Yeltsin, Kuchma, and the others, might not have been Kuchma at that time, decided to declare independence from the Soviet Union. And essentially, by early December, that's what they did. And by the end of December, the Soviet Union dissolved. So then you have modern Ukraine's borders. 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution. This goes back to our old friend, Viktor Yanukovych. And allegations of ballot stuffing, allegations that this wasn't a legitimate election. You had the Orange Revolution, and a new election was done, and he was no longer the president. This absolutely terrified Vladimir Putin, terrified the Russian Siloviki, if you know what that term is. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Along with the other colored revolutions, the Rose Revolution, the Tulip Revolution, Rose in Georgia, Tulip in Kyrgyzstan. Did not want to see this type of revolution occurring in Russia. Let's come a little bit closer. I spoke a little bit earlier in 2013 and 2014, the so-called Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan protests. When, again, legitimately elected in 2010, Yanukovych was back in power, and he decided to turn east instead of this association agreement and deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine. And he was ousted from power, and we know the rest of the story from that point. The Russian reaction, the annexation of Crimea, which is, I'm not really going to go into detail here. We might be able to cover it in Q&A. But there are some interesting things about Crimea that we should keep into account. We had the Russian occupation and support to separatists in the Donbass region, in Luhansk and Donetsk. And in case we forget, this means Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. When people say, oh, well, there's an imminent Russian invasion, they've already invaded it. They've been invaded since 2014 for the past 8 years. How many people in my smart audience know how many people have died in this war in eastern Ukraine? Approximately 14,000, most of those Ukrainians, soldiers and locals. So they're already under invasion. There's no threat of invasion. They've been invaded. Now there is a threat of further invasion, an invasion of the rest of the country. This is what started in the spring of last year, Russian troop movements near Ukraine, and then more recently, the end of last year and up to the current time. Let's talk about history a little bit. Before we do that, we can look at a map or two here. So this is a little bit old when I put this presentation here together and when I pulled this map off here, but it's essentially still correct. Those big arrows you see are potential lines of advance by the Russian military, the ground forces, to attack, possibly fully invade Ukraine. We can see up here Belarus, Russian forces up here, very close to Kiev. We're talking 50 to 60 miles. You could get there in a day if you didn't have too many problems with your armored forces. You have forces, of course, stationed here in the Kursk area, Bryansk, and this part of Russia, in eastern Ukraine itself, in Crimea, even in Transnistria, this enclave of Moldova. And then what we don't have showing here are Russian amphibious ships in the Black Sea area, maybe to take Odessa. A little bit of perhaps a history lesson here. You might hear the term New Russia sometimes. New Russia refers to this area in here, this part, this kind of lower third, southeastern third of Ukraine. This might be a potential target of Vladimir Putin as well. Control the Black Sea, cut off Ukraine from its ports. Okay. So why does Russia care? History counts. No matter what any analyst would tell you, Russia, and in this case, think Putin, considers Ukraine part of its country. If you can't get through that through your head, you've got something else coming. This is what he considers. Ukraine's not a separate country. It's part of Russia, according to him. He would say Ukraine's made up. It's really part Eastern European and part Russian. And the funny thing is, there's some truth in that, but it's how you spin it. It's conveniently and cleverly manipulated. Point number two here. In fact, if you look at the very word Ukraine, it's derived from a Russian word krai, which means border, edge, frontier. So frontier lands. That's just the frontier of Russia. It's not a separate country. With the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia cannot stand the fact that Kiev in Russian, Kiev in Ukrainian, is no longer in Russia. In the Soviet Union, no big deal. We were all comrades and brothers together, right? Kiev was part of the empire, part of the Soviet Union. But upon the breakup, it no longer was. Why this love for Kiev? Why is it important? Well, historically, we think of the Kievan Rus, right? The Kievskaya Rus. You may not be able to read this up here, but essentially what we're talking about is this is the first really Russian nation that ever existed. Let's say it was more or less a country year 880 AD to, well, till the Mongols came in the latter part of the 13th century. But the Kievan Rus is one of these, it's part of their national myth. It's not a myth that actually occurred. Kievan Rus was a real entity, along with at the time some other empires that were still around, Byzantine Empire, Holy Roman Empire, etc., Caliphate as well. But we have to remember, Kiev was one of the capitals. It became the capital of the Kievan Rus, so to speak. And the fact that the first Russian nation, its capital is no longer in Russia, is a problem. In some respects, it'd be like taking, like Texas breaking apart and the Alamo no longer in Texas. Think of it like that. All right, why else does Russia care? Security invasion. So I teach a US-Russia relations course, and these are factual. You cannot deny the fact that Russia has had a security problem from its west, historically. Now, the most successful invasion that probably ever occurred was the Mongol invasion in the latter part of the 13th century. Now, these are my words, by the way. Some historians may disagree with me, and that's okay, when I call them the four great invasions. You may argue the time of troubles or not, but the time of troubles was a period of instability, invasions by Sweden, by Poland, usurpers to the crown, to be czar. And if you're a historian, you know that this represented the end of the Rurik dynasty. And then by 1613, you had the beginning of the Romanov dynasty with Mikhail Romanov, and back to legitimacy, so to speak, which, the Romanov dynasty lasted for another 300 plus years till the abdication and eventual assassination of Tsar Nicholas II. The two invasions that probably go into the mind of Russians today who are concerned about invasions from the West certainly is going to be the Napoleonic invasion of 1812. And of course, the far more recent one, and one that occurred during Soviet times, World War II, what the Russians refer to as a Great Patriotic War. 27 million Soviets died in World War II. Those are accurate figures, researched, peer-reviewed. Not all of those soldiers, civilians, women, men, children. This is a big deal. It's a legitimate security concern. Keep that in mind. See if I have anything else I want to say here. There are a few things I want to add here. As a result of these security concerns, Russia thinks of security in a hard sense, what we might consider a 19th century sense, because of a lack of natural barriers in its western border regions. We're going to look at a topographical map here in a minute, in between it and the rest of Europe. When we think of the effects of Russia-Soviet Union on Europe's security architecture since World War II, we certainly think of two major events: Yalta, which helped create the division buffer states for the Soviet Union, and then the end of the Cold War, which from a Russian point of view saw the loss of control over those buffer states and eventual NATO encroachment to its borders. Remember, this is from a Russian point of view. Don't forget that for many Russians, especially the Siloviki, these are people from the security services who have infiltrated by whatever means necessary into the government to control a government, like former KGB, FSB, SVR, etc. So for many Russians, especially those Siloviki like Putin and his closest advisors, the Cold War never really ended. And the breakup of the Soviet Union represented the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And it has been Russia's intent to reverse that loss of power, control, respect ever since, particularly since Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin came to power in the year 2000. All right, so let's look at a topographical map here for a moment. Physical relief. It's at a very high level. There are obviously some obstacles here and there, but when you look at major obstacles like the Alps, the Carpathian Mountains, yeah, okay, maybe Hannibal was able to cross the mountains down here, but there's generally no big mountain ranges. So from this great northern European plain, France, Germany, and here, getting into Russia, relatively few obstacles. Some rivers, there's some problems here and there. So what does Russia think of in terms of security? Space. Trading space for time to be able to prepare. Having buffer states to them is important, particularly from invasions from the West. Ukraine, by the way, which you can see outlined right here, has been on those invasion routes. This is fact. All right, let's look at Ukraine itself. We can't forget, if we come into what we're talking about today about Ukraine, you can see it's a relatively flat country. There are highlands in here, particularly, but not these mountains, not the Carpathians right there. Relatively flat. There are rivers, which are obstacles. You ever heard of the term steppe? S-T-E-P-P-E? What we might refer to as the prairie or the plains in the United States or Canada. This is grassy plains. This is what much of Ukraine is made up of. Why else is Ukraine important? Strategic crossroads. It's a buffer state between Europe and Russia. Agricultural, huge agricultural belts. Wall Street Journal, by the way, today did a great video on the importance of wheat that's grown in Ukraine. Industrial belts, particularly in eastern Ukraine. That's why Russia really wanted eastern Ukraine, those industrial belts. It's been contested for centuries, Ukraine has. And in this, President Putin is correct. It's part Eastern European, it's part Russian in that sense. Ukraine has been in various parts of history, parts of Russia, Poland, Austro-Hungarian Empire, others, Lithuania in the past. Today, Russia sees a Western-backed government in Kyiv and does not believe that Ukraine should be totally sovereign. He doesn't really want it to Europeanize. All right, let's talk about energy here for a minute. A lot of this argument today about Russia and Ukraine is centered around energy. Lots of pipelines go through Ukraine, natural gas pipelines. We're going to look at a map here in just a moment. A lot of Russian gas that gets to an actual paying market, Germany. That's where a lot of the hard currency reserves of Russia comes from, is Germans paying for this natural gas, billions of dollars. It goes through Ukraine. Control of those countries that the pipelines transit remains a key goal of Russia. Russia threatens or will turn off gas to Ukraine, especially in winter, but it's more hesitant to do so when it loses hard currency purchases from Europe, from gas that transits Ukraine. One reason why it has built Nord Stream 1 and 2. We talk a lot about Nord Stream 2 today and how we're not going to let it, continue to operate. Of course, it's not even operating yet if Russia invades, but Nord Stream 1 is already operating. We can't forget that. So what it could do in this case is it could cut off Ukrainian gas and still get gas to its paying customers. Of course, Russia can use its energy weapon on Europe, especially Germany, to pursue its geopolitical goals, as is feared in the current crisis. All right, so let's look at these pipelines here for a minute. You can look at this slide here. Essentially, the red arrows are where gas comes into Ukraine, primarily from Russia, and then it exits. And then it exits into, what we used to call Eastern Europe, culturally, and then goes into Germany. It's another way to look at it. And this map right here also shows the Nord Stream 1 and 2, and see how it cleverly avoids most land. It's going underneath the Baltic right to Germany. This is why it's a big deal. Why else does Russia care? They cannot get it through their head that NATO, or they have this fascination with NATO as the enemy. NATO was the enemy during the Cold War, so it's easy to hold on to that. So it is again. What we might call NATO enlargement, they would call encroachment, the Russians, or expansion to its borders. We often hear about commitments by the West at the end of the Cold War. We will not go 1 inch further east. Words to that effect. So NATO would not expand. We certainly agreed that no forces would go into East Germany, former East Germany. And to my knowledge today, there's no US Army units stationed in East Germany. What was East Germany? Of course, there might be some further east. Drives Russia nuts. What really drove Russia nuts was the enlargement, the first enlargement of the so-called Visegrad countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary in 1999, and then later on with the Baltic republics and other countries in Eastern Europe in 2004. Particularly the Baltic republics, although not traditionally, although we never recognized them as part of the Soviet Union, as I mentioned before, not traditionally Russian. Since they were part of the Soviet Union, they saw them as theirs. NATO. All right, so a couple of maps here. This is an old map. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but this is during, well, the height of the Cold War. So you have the Soviet Union, no breakout of Ukraine or Belarus or the Baltics. And then you have the Eastern Bloc countries right here, East Germany, Poland, etc. This was this nice buffer that the Soviet Union enjoyed during the Cold War. And they had some legitimate concerns. The end of what, as I said, World War II, 27 million Soviet deaths. How many deaths in the United States, by the way? Almost none in comparison, but of course there were. 300 some odd thousand. Roughly 2/3 of that in the European theater of war. So understandable that they might want this buffer. So now we compare it, sorry about that. Now we compare it, that's the map we just looked at, to where we're at today. So you can see that Soviet Union, ceased to exist. Russian borders are back here. Here's Ukraine, here's Belarus, here's former Eastern Bloc, Warsaw Pact countries, all now members of NATO. And remember, we're looking at this from a Russian point of view. Here's another map that you can see by year, the expansions. The last so-called legitimate expansion that the Russians would accept would be in 1990, when East Germany was integrated into West Germany to become the Federal Republic of Germany, even though West Germany was already known like that. They were okay with that. Matter of fact, it was agreed to in the so-called 2+4 agreements at the end of the Cold War. One of the demands that President Putin has that has precipitated this crisis is no further expansion of NATO, particularly Ukraine and Georgia, number one. Number two, that any NATO forces should be pushed back to their 1997 positions, and no strike weapons in Eastern Europe, meaning INF type weapons. All right, so why else does Russia care? As I said earlier, the declaration at the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO someday, that pushed it too far for Russia. We can directly attribute actions such as the invasion of Georgia in 2008, formal occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I'll show you a map here in a moment on that. And then in 2014, when Ukraine tried to turn west, the annexation of Crimea and occupation of eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region. There's the territories in Georgia. And now, of course, Ukraine again. And just to point out, so there's Crimea, there's eastern Ukraine that's under occupation. By the way, one of the potential goals that that Putin may be looking at for this is just simply to get a land bridge to Crimea, because right now the Kerch Strait over here is connected by a bridge. So if you were to have a land bridge here, you could resolve a lot of issues that Crimea does, including water. There's a lot of water problems there. So now I'm channeling myself, some other specialists that I know, and a lot of reading here. What the heck does Putin want? Well, number one is probably the truth, if you read that. He wants to safeguard his legacy. He wants to safeguard his billions. But what else? He wants to reestablish that buffer with the West and NATO. That's why he wants to go back to those 1997 positions. It's unclear. Of course, the goal would be for those former Warsaw Pact countries not to be in NATO, but he might be able to live with that as long as there's no NATO forces stationed there, meaning the United States, France, Germany, etc. Respect. This is so much at the center of, likely the center of Vladimir Putin's problems. He's like Rodney Dangerfield. I get no respect, right? He wants to be respected, like the US and China. Don't forget about me. It's as much psychological as anything else. There's a great quote. I'm going to read from this book right here, written by Bill Burns. Anybody ever heard of this guy? Former ambassador to Russia and current director of the CIA. I want to make sure I find it here. He's talking about an email that he wrote to then Secretary of State Condi Rice. In an email to Rice shortly afterward, I tried again to explain the mindset in the Kremlin. The Munich speech, this is referring to 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, when Putin really gave it to the West verbally. He said, the Munich speech was a self-absorbed product of 15 years of accumulated Russian frustrations and grievances, amplified by Putin's own sense that Russia's concerns are still often taken for granted or ignored. Understanding the Kremlin was as much about psychology as about geopolitics. It's immensely satisfying psychologically to be able to take a whack at people after so many years of being down on their luck, and for Russians, nothing is more satisfying than poking at Americans with whom they have tried to compare themselves for so long. And this was all in his email. Then he writes in his text here, this was a moment that had particular appeal for Russia's president. He continues in his email. A large element was pure Putin, the attraction of swaggering into a den of transatlantic security wonks, sticking out his chin and letting them have it with both barrels. I think Burns has got the guy keyed in just right. We talked about the energy markets a little bit. Domestic stability. There are some problems with domestic stability in Russia. After 2014, or after the invasion of Crimea, the annexation, his popularity went up and it was legitimate. Russia, great power again. It may be different this time. But it's not unusual for a politician from any country to create a foreign crisis to raise your domestic popularity. Never heard of that before. Wag the tail, right? And perhaps also to secure his legacy. I've taken this country, Russia, which was in a shambles, and I've made it a great country again, perhaps a great empire once again. So this is about legacy building, this is an empire. Take this mess he was handed and correct it. Many analysts will tell you If Russia controls Ukraine, it's truly an empire. So why now? These are some guesses. Russia's military is not the same military it was in 2014, particularly not in 2008. When it invaded Georgia in 2008, yeah, it was able to sweep aside the Georgian forces without too many problems, but they had a lot of their own problems, a lot of fratricide, a lot of friendly fire on the Russian side. They were dusting off old Soviet manuals, trying to figure out how to do it. They've thrown away their Soviet manuals. They've looked at how the West does operations. They're much better at what they do. They've modernized. By the way, Ukraine's military is not what it was in 2014. They're better prepared. I still probably wouldn't bet on them in a stand-up fight with the Russians, but this may be the time to strike if there ever is one before the Ukrainian army gets any stronger. The US is distracted by domestic divisions. What's going on in the United States right now? We're upset about COVID. Do I wear the damn mask or not? Republicans, Democrats, Trump, Biden, we're all upset. We're distracted. Could be a good time. The Afghanistan withdrawal. Sign of American weakness? Question mark. Certainly from Putin's point of view, it is. European countries may not be united. Backsliding of democracy in Hungary and Poland. Germany's kind of, can I get out of jail free card here with all the energy? We really like the Russian gas. 40% of Germany's gas is Russian. China is supporting Russia, made it very clear at the Olympics the other day. Though they didn't mention specifically, Xi did not mention specifically Ukraine, but he's supporting Russia. And maybe push NATO back while he still can to take care of this unfinished business. Some further thoughts of mine, and then I have one more slide and I'll end it and I'll go to questions. If there is this Russian fascination, this fear of NATO expansion to its borders, okay, from one point of view, yeah, that's a problem. But does NATO really threaten Russia? Has NATO ever attacked Russia? Has the United States ever attacked Russia? Let's not talk about 1918 and 1920. It's a different topic. Matter of fact, the United States allied with the Soviet Union, with Russia during World War II to defeat a common enemy. I would argue NATO is exporting security to Russia's border. It's never been more secure in the West than it's been today. Russian generals should go to sleep very soundly at night. They're not going to attack us. Why would they? It's ridiculous. It's suicidal. Ask Napoleon, ask Hitler. It's a dumb idea. Ukraine of 2022 is not the Ukraine of 2014. If Russia decides to do any military incursion in Ukraine, Ukraine will fight. Ukraine was probably more pro-Russian pre-2014. Now, did you want to create a truly separate Ukrainian identity? It's happened. Ukrainians are proud of what they've done. They're proud that they've been able to withstand this invasion since 2014. Be careful, Russia, you might win. But you might be fighting a partisan war like you did in Afghanistan. And we saw how that ended. Don't trust what Putin says, trust what he does. You remember that saying from 1987 that President Reagan and Gorbachev always joked about? Trust but verify when referring to the INF Treaty. So the new one, I'm trying to work on one. Don't trust, and you got to show me. And I'm channeling my inner Missourian there, right? Show me state. So don't trust, but verify, and verify a lot. How would I grade the Biden administration's handling of the crisis? I'd give them an A-. I think they're doing pretty well. What more could we do? You're going to send American armored divisions into Ukraine? A little bit too little too late. That's why there's a minus there, but I think they've actually done a pretty good job diplomatically, getting some military weapons into there just in time. But if you're Ukraine, you're going, well, finally, we've been asking for these forever. It takes a crisis for us to get it. All right, some ending thoughts. As I mentioned up front, this is not just about Ukraine. This is about a 30-year reckoning. This is an attempt by Putin in his mind to reset the clock back to the future. Let's go back to the 80s, at least the late 90s. before NATO expansion. We could be seeing the next, the third shifting of European Euro-Atlantic security architecture since the end of World War II. First one would be Yalta, the division of Europe. Second one is the end of the Cold War. What's happening now? That could be the third one. Ultimately, Putin would love to get the United States out of Europe. And to some Americans deep inside of us, we've never really wanted to be involved with Europe militarily. Heck, it took 2 wars for us to get there. There's not been a true Russian stake in European security since 1990. I actually think that's a legitimate point. There should be a stake for Russia in Europe. They are, after all, partly in Europe. Putin definitely wants Russia back in European and global security. And ultimately, he would like the US to treat Russia like it did the Soviet Union. Respected, but feared. Is this where we're going to? All right. Questions from my friend Vladimir. All right, so I'll stop there. I'll leave this up here. I've taken about 40 minutes to go through this presentation. You can agree, disagree. I'm happy to debate. And I do want to mention that and we'll take some questions from the audience here. And then Chris Sartorius in the back is going to be, we're also going to be getting questions from people on Zoom. So I hope that people can hear me on Zoom fairly well. We'll go first with you, Jackie, and then to you, sir. Sure. Sure. Well, so I'll try to channel my inner Ukrainian here, as I've been educated by some of my Ukrainian and Russian friends who are out there, I think, listening, hopefully, on Zoom here today. So they'll probably be chuckling when I give this remark. But what I'll tell you is, yes, of course, there are many ethnic Russians in Ukraine who consider themselves Ukrainians, by the way. Let me go back to my comment about 2014 or pre-2014. A lot more feelings of connection, love, perhaps even for Russia. I mean, we're talking, that Russia and Ukraine are very close. As I said, linguistically close, culturally close, historically close. There's Ukrainians married to Russians, Russians married to Ukrainians. I don't want to compare it to the United States and Canada, but it's in the same universe. That kind of relationship where you have lots of connections across that border. And if you were looking to want to unite Ukraine and Russia, attacking Ukraine by Russia is probably not the way to do it. It would be maybe what Hillary Clinton would have called smart power to do something else, or soft power, different ways to do it rather than actually invading. But yes, no doubt about it. The hotbed of Russian nationalism in Ukraine, of course, we would consider to be in eastern Ukraine. Ask any Russians, ethnic Russians who live in eastern Ukraine now, if their life is better now than it was before 2014. I don't know. It'd be like, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? This is what Reagan would say in 1984, right, when he ran for re-election. But in all seriousness, are they really happy that Russia came at this point? Some probably are. I would argue many are not. Yes, sir. Yeah.
My point in this is Putin has a state of Russian strength. Part of the point to those days.
Sure.
Not to be Stalin, not to be Hitler. I mean, the flag. You refer to it as war in Austria.
No doubt in my mind. I can tell you my Putin story, but yeah.
Having control over what he does or that he do it from power.
Well, I would argue, based on my knowledge, and there may be people in here who are better educated on this than I am, but I would argue that If we use the mafia comparison, he's the godfather, and everyone falls in line to him. When he came to power early on, his message to rich oligarchs who enriched themselves with the fall of the Soviet Union, he said, "You can do anything you want. You can make as much money as you want. You step into the political ring, I will crush you." You ever heard of Yukos? Oh no, everyone's forgotten about that. Who's the guy? His name escaped me at the top of the moment. Who's now sitting in jail? Or no, he got out. He's in the West now. But yeah, no, it's legitimate. Legitimate question. Chris, do we want to take a question or two from the Zoom audience? Yes.
This question is from Jonathan Madrid. Do you believe that Russia will conduct actions with respect to China and then provide a coalition against the United States to achieve their goals?
It's certainly a possibility. I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I would be writing a book and making some money off of that. But it's certainly, look, there's definitely some coordinated actions here between Russia and China. I would be very concerned about any precedent that might have been set with Afghanistan. Is this going to be set with Ukraine? And therefore, might be set with Taiwan or some other location in the South China Sea. We've seen increased Chinese activity around Taiwan, but this has happened for a few years now. To my knowledge, sorry about that, to my knowledge, there's been no further increased activity than we've it's almost routine now. But that is certainly a worry that I would have. And by the way, North Korea is always being a distracting person. Rocket Man that's a great term. If there's one thing that President Trump really got right, was calling him Rocket Man, right? And so Rocket Man wants attention, and he shoots off a few rockets and says, "Don't forget about me." So that's a distraction potentially as well. But yes, I would be very concerned. Thank you. Another question from you, Chris, and then we'll come back to the audience here. Yeah, we'll come back to you. We have plenty of time. I can. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the question is about, from Kim Fischel, is about the U.S. Apparently leaking intelligence about Russia's doing as a tactic to basically stop Russia from doing what it wants to do. It is interesting. I would answer that in a couple different ways. One, there is a lot of interesting open source intelligence out there now, which if you're an intelligence agency, you never really want to reveal your sources and methods, right? But there's civilian satellites that are taking pictures. You can easily say, well, the U.S. military, we refer to what this company has shown you, and can say, yeah, that's right, without revealing sources or methods. But as a tactic, Kim, yeah, I actually think it's brilliant in this particular case. My own personal feeling is if they had not done this, you would have seen military action before now. We called the Russians out on false flag operations. If you don't know what a false flag operation is, it would be like the Russians attacking themselves and blaming it on the Ukrainians, and then giving them an incentive to go in, an excuse to go in. There was the talk about that came from the UK about I can't remember the Ukrainian fellow's name, who would be installed as a puppet government for Russia. And undoubtedly, I don't know this, but undoubtedly the US released that intelligence to the Brits, and then the Brits released that. So it didn't directly come from us. But yeah, I think it's a brilliant move up to this point, and it's keeping the Russians at bay. Yeah, so let me go over here back to the audience here, and one or two questions from here, and then we'll go. Oh, Mustafa, you were next, right? Yeah, sorry, you, and then over here. Mustafa, go ahead. So the question from one of my students, Mustafa, thank you for asking the question, is what if Putin weren't in power? What if it was someone else, say a President Navalny, Kasyanov, Chubay, someone else from the past who was more liberal? There's a couple areas of thought on this. One is Putin would say, matter of fact, good old Bill Burns quotes him in his book. Putin would say, even a liberal Russian would not want Ukraine to join NATO. And I think that there is some credence to that, but that's probably dated now. I think it depends on who you have. If Medvedev were truly had power and were president today, I don't think it would be such an issue. I don't think he'd be happy about it, but I don't know if he would threaten Ukraine because it's going to backfire. So I think a lot of this is driven by Putin, but I think there's also kind of an innate Russian feeling. Yeah, I just don't like that kind of alliance that we were an enemy with for so long being right next to our border. Even if I go to sleep knowing, yeah, they're not really going to attack us. There is a legitimate Russian fear of invasion. Heck, we even talked about Russia maybe joining NATO. 22 years ago, we talked about this, particularly right after 9/11. We talked about reigniting the grand alliance from World War II. When we united together to defeat Nazi Germany after 9/11, President Putin apparently is the first person to call President Bush and say, it wasn't us, number one, so please don't go to war against us. Number two, we want to join you in a war on terrorism. There were legitimate aspects of that. The subtext was, please don't pay attention to what we're doing in Chechnya. They're all terrorists, right? So, yeah, there were some talks. Matter of fact, I did my master's thesis on the implications of Russian Federation membership in NATO 20 some odd years ago. My bottom line conclusion, it's a bad idea. It would tear the alliance apart, exactly what Russia wants. Over here.
Yes, I have this time. We got on the topic of intelligence. Do you think that there's a possibility that Russia is playing into purposely leaking some information to contribute to a potential bluff? Like there is a legitimate fear of invasion, but there is also some of the idea that
it's possible. I mean, leave it to the Russians to muddy up the situation, muddle it all up, and to be confused. What's exactly going to happen? Precisely. If I were to channel my inner Putin in me, I would say anything that I can do to destabilize Ukraine, to destabilize the West, is good for me. This goes back to kind of a zero-sum mentality. What's bad for them is good for me. What's bad for me is good for them. But yeah, I mean, I would certainly not put it past intelligence releases or anything to muddle up the situation. Yeah. We'll go to here and then we'll go to 2 or 3 questions online. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so, well, I would recommend a number of sources, which would include, by the way, the English, the Kremlin's own website in English to see what they're saying, so you can kind of decode what's going on there. But legitimate sources in my particular case, I mean, the ones that you would probably know, the Wall Street Journal, I think, is excellent reporting. The New York Times is doing a very good job on this. Look at their national security affairs correspondent, David Sanger, who's written a lot about cyber war, cyber attacks from Russia. I would say they're very credible. Foreign Affairs Journal, can't go wrong with that. The Atlantic Council, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, even. There's some independent, there's still some independent media in Russia. Medusa is one of them. I would even go to the English language Moscow Times. I read them and I'm not fully convinced that that they're in Putin's pocket. It's interesting. They have some good articles in there as well. I would look to institutions. Brookings Institution has really good coverage. I would look to some individuals. Richard Haas, he's commented on this. Some really great insight from him. Angela Stent, highly respected person. Matter of fact, I used one of her books in my course in my U.S.-Russia course. So those would be some examples. I wouldn't forget the Kyiv Independent either. Yeah. Let's go for 2 or 3 questions and we'll come back over here. Go ahead, Chris.
were successful.
That's a really good question. This is kind of the day after question. What happens if this actually occurs, and it just very well might. Remember, we were talking about this very date, February 16th, could be the invasion date, could be any time this week. As long as Russia has capabilities, and they do have the capability to fully invade Ukraine right now, that is a question. But what do we do on the day after? Well, certainly we have to take the Biden administration at its heart on reactions, severe economic sanctions. Would indeed Nord Stream 2 just be, what's going to happen with that? What does severe economic sanctions mean? Are we going to kick Russia out of the SWIFT system for banking? There's a little bit of backup with China, but it's just probably not enough. So what's Putin's next move at this point? Well, that's a good question. There's always a potential, by the way, for what I would call a Putin surprise. It may not be about Ukraine at all. Maybe there'll be increased pressure on the Baltics. Maybe there'll be a resumption of nuclear weapons testing in Novaya Zemlya. There could be something that we just haven't anticipated. From a Western reaction, if Ukraine is invaded fully, I would suspect that Europe would fall in line with the United States with severe sanctions. We'd have to try and figure out, we are already doing it to a degree, contingency plans for energy for Europe and for Germany. And NATO's eastern flank is, you're going to see American armored formations back in Europe. Where do you go from there? Do you really want it to go further west? I would say that instead of having the policy of not 1 inch further east that we talked about by Secretary of State James Baker back then, we would be probably telling the Russians not 1 further inch west at this point. Next question from the audience, or from the online. Do you think the removal of Russian troops after the recent military exercise is a sign of de-escalation? If not, how do you feel about an imminent Russia? Right. So the question is about, we've seen reports from the Kremlin that the Russians are removing troops from around Ukraine. These, so far, to my knowledge, up until an hour before I came in to do this presentation, I've been staying up. As far as I can tell, the United States and NATO has said we don't see any indications of any troop withdrawal or any major withdrawals. This could be troops who are local. They're already stationed in these areas, which are going back to their normal cantonment areas. But even if you're talking 10 or 20,000 troops, what about the other 130? What about what's going on in Belarus? So I don't see this as legitimate. I would want, if I were the West, I would want OSCE observers to go in and see this. Is this really happening? Of course, Russia won't let anybody into its own territory, but it's concerning. By the way, all of these troop movements violate arms accords that we had in the past. The conventional forces in Europe moving huge armored formations around. Are they notifying anybody about it? Don't trust what Putin says, trust what he does. One more question from online, and then we'll come back to the audience. Here. Do you think Western media is overhyping the threat? Specifically, the Russian to install a new government in Kiev? And that's another part of the question. Is the left be downplaying any still investment in Ukraine to the economy? Yeah, tough questions to answer. This is the question is about, is this a bluff, essentially, or not? This threat of invasion, and is the West overreacting? Is Zelensky, is trying to have his people be more calm? What about all of that? So I would tell you, having been a former military person myself, who was involved in the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, I was an armored warrior. You don't deploy armored forces unless you intend to do something with that. It could be a show of force, but that's an awfully expensive show of force. There are maps. I don't have them in my presentation, but you can see how far some of these Russian troops came from the eastern districts, thousands of miles by rail. You don't do that just for fun. I'm very concerned about this. I don't think that this is that sounds almost, and I know who this is. I think it's a former student of mine, Dylan Sowers. who asked that question. What this is the Russians would say that the West is overreacting. The Russians would say, we have no plans to invade Ukraine. Just like Putin said, there are no Russian troops in Crimea. And then a few months later, he admitted, yeah, those were Russian troops. Again, my bottom line there is don't trust what the man says, trust what he does. Let's come back to, yes, sir, and then over here to Jackie.
Big picture, both like global geopolitics, do you think this is a potential return to great power politics?
Yeah, so the question is this a return to great power competition from, kind of pre-World War I, actually? I think it's an attempt to do that. I think that, as I said, this is not just about Ukraine. Maybe a little bit. This is about resetting the rules-based international order that the United States and the West built after World War II, whether it's through institutions like the beginnings of the EU, to the UN, to the Bretton Woods agreements that came out before the end of World War II about, the IMF and the World Bank, and basically establishing a new world order, if I can use those terms in a positive sense, right? And this is certainly an attempt by autocrats in Russia and China to reset the world order in their favor. And it has a chance of success. Jackie, you had a question?
Yeah. Basically, there's been a lot of discussion on, if does invade, then will the U.S. expand military force,
Yeah. So the question is, if Russia does invade Ukraine, will the U.S. use force in Ukraine to help repel that? President Biden has been clear from day one on this. There will be no U.S. troops fighting Russian troops in Ukraine. And if I can paraphrase him, he said, because if you have American soldiers killing Russian soldiers, you get to a world war. And we don't want to go back to that slide that I showed you with the big mushroom cloud, right? This is where that kind of escalation could go to. That's exactly why I put that particular slide up there. What we would do is reinforce our eastern flank of NATO because Ukraine is not in NATO. It's a partner of NATO. By the way, Russia technically is a partner of NATO too, technically, but it does not fall under the sacred Article 5 agreement. And this is the most important article of NATO, which essentially means an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all, and all force deemed necessary will be used to repel that attack. So that would be the military reaction in this particular sense, I think, would be to reinforce NATO's eastern flank. You'd see more American troops there, perhaps some others from our allies, the French, the British, for instance. You would see the severe economic sanctions. I think as long as you had a working Ukrainian government, I certainly would see collaboration with that government, more weapons coming, intelligence passing, aid for sure for food. And, if you let's think about the other consequences. There's always second, third, fourth, fifth order consequences of an invasion that we never think about. We could have millions of refugees pouring into Western Europe, pouring into Poland. How are we going to deal with that? So those are all issues that would keep us busy. Good question. Yeah, Mustafa. So the question is the time period in terms of the seasons, is this critical, similar to the time in Crimea 8 years ago in 2014? Now, Crimea was a little bit different. And again, I didn't want to go too far down that rabbit hole of Crimea, because Crimea is a little bit of a different beast here. Crimea traditionally, of course, part of Russia for a long time. part of many other countries, by the way, in the past. But famously given to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev in this case. And that kind of set up this artificial problem with Crimea, because all of a sudden, again, people woke up on December 26, 1991 and said, oh, not only is Kiev no longer in Russia, Crimea is not in Russia. What's going on? So the whole Crimea thing, although I don't agree with what happened, forcible change of borders, there's more to it. There's an asterisk there. Now, as far as the timing is concerned for an invasion of Ukraine, yeah, I mean, I think that because of the relatively poor road networks in most of the former Soviet Union, you have emerald cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, beautiful first world cities in a third world country. Don't take offense to that. There's a lot of truth in all of that. And so when you don't have a well-developed road network, you have to rely, if you're an invading army, on the ground, right? The terrain that's out there. And if you're in the rainy season, ask the Germans. They have great newsreels about them being stuck in the mud. This is a real maneuver problem. So when the ground is frozen, much better time in that part of the world to invade. Outside of the rains, or if it's dry and hot, that's a good time too. But in the winter, yeah, right now is a good time. I don't know what the latest weather has been in that part of Ukraine right now. I assume it's still pretty cold and icy. Yeah, one more question, Mustafa, then we'll go back online. So the question is, it's a timing question with Putin in power. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Would the question be, if he were not to invade Ukraine and he eventually goes out of power, would it happen in the future? Is that kind of where you're going towards? Oh, I see. So that would be his crowning achievement. Then he can retire and fade into glory, right? Yes. Okay, I understand. No, I think that he sees this as the beginning of, or the continuing of the rebuilding of the old, maybe not the Soviet Empire, but the Russian Empire. Georgia's destabilized at this point, but I'm sure he would love to see the rest of Georgia back into a new Russian Empire. Love to see the Baltic countries into there, but of course, with the Baltic countries in NATO, that gives him pause. But yeah, no, I would not. If he were to successfully invade Ukraine, take Ukraine for Russia, make it a part of the Russian Federation, or give it some sort of autonomous status within the Russian Federation, but essentially run by Russia, I think he would be emboldened at this point. Yeah. Chris, we'll go back to you. So the question is about could NATO should NATO agree not to allow Ukraine into it, or maybe there could be a moratorium. There's been talk of a 10 or 15-year moratorium where NATO or Ukraine says, yeah, we're not going to do it for this amount of time. Would that help the situation? Well, it's hard to see. Number one, I don't see NATO going back on its word. It's for them, it's a principle. If they were to go back on it, then where do you stop? We might. I don't think it's the same thing as appeasement. There's no Munich moment, I don't think. But at the same time, if Putin is able to achieve an objective without actually using his military forces, then okay, well, what else can I do without using it? So I don't see NATO saying no. But if you're a realist in every sense, Ukraine is not ready to join NATO. May never be. Certainly, there are two countries, France and Germany, which are definitely not on board. Look how hard it's been, to change the topic slightly here for a moment, look how hard it's been to get Turkey into the EU. They've been working on that for decades with great supporters in the rest of the EU. Sorry?
The idea of Turkey way
Yeah, so But to come back to this, no, what about a moratorium? There have been, actually by one of my former colleagues, I won't mention his name, that I served with in Embassy Moscow. He recently came out with an article. I guess I could mention his name, it's out in public. But he opined that perhaps Ukraine should come out and say, we won't join NATO for 15 years, period. Moratorium, no more talk on this, just leave it alone. The question is, would that be enough for Putin? My guess is no. But I don't know what the man's thinking. We got to ask him directly. I don't know if that would be enough. Maybe it would be. Let me go on for a moment. We could talk about the so-called term Finlandization of Ukraine. Maybe some good ideas, but most Finns I speak to today say that's a terrible idea. Although other Finns would say the relationship with the Soviet Union post-World War II was pretty good. We lost part of our country, but we removed all of our people out of the Karelian Peninsula, resettled them in other parts of Finland, and we actually had a good relationship. So, it's up for debate. From a Ukrainian point of view, and I know there may be some Ukrainians out there listening, I think Ukrainians would like a definitive yes or no for NATO as well, even if they're not ready. I think some Ukrainians would be like, let us in or tell us no. Be done with it. Because it's a tease up to now. There are very smart analysts, American analysts, who would say, just don't even, why do we even have to talk about this? Let's get NATO and Ukraine off of the talking points. Let's get it out. Let's just not talk about it. Get it off of the agenda. This is not realistic. All right, Chris, to your questions. Yeah, I'd have to check my weather charts. If I recall correctly, that part of the world is famous for its spring rains. This is why Ukraine is a very famous agricultural leader. The famous black soil, I've seen it myself. I've put black soil in my hands. It's pretty nice soil. In some ways, reminds me of the Sacramento River Valley out in California. Great growing soil, which was where I'm from. So yeah, I think that goes into consideration. But at the end of the day, an army does what it's told to do. And if Putin says, well, fine, it's not going to matter to me. You boys need to figure this out. Maybe I could channel my inner Donald Rumsfeld and say, you go to war with the army that you got, the situation that you have. If any of you know what I mean by that. So I think it's, I think, who asked the question? Was it Mark? Did you say? Mark. So yeah, Mark, I think that it's part of that analysis, that you go through, military guys go through. I can't remember all the definitions, MET-T and all of this kind of stuff. I think that goes into it. But at the end of the day, I think Putin's going to do what he wants to do when he wants to do. Now, we might not be talking about an invasion of all of Ukraine. Remember, we could be talking about, let me go back to that invasion graphic. Right here. We could be talking about New Russia. Down here. Now, do we really need to take Kiev? Do we really need to do city fighting? If we go into there, a lot of people are going to die. Russia's going to look bad. So maybe we're looking at something else. Maybe it could just be formalizing, as the Russian parliament asked the president now to do, the Russian president, to formally recognize these as independent countries. Of course, Ukraine can never agree to that, because if they do, it's the end of their political administration. Another question out there, Chris? And then we'll come to you.
I think we are dealing seriously with Putin. His ending agenda is to unite Russia. Putin is a hardline communist. Your thought?
I don't think he's a hardline communist. I think he has some nostalgia for the Soviet Union, but I think that he is someone who wants to fill his pockets with everybody's money. I don't think he has a particular ideology other than to enrich himself and his buddies and his family as much as he can. I think probably in there somewhere there is a true Russian nationalist or patriot in there as well. But I don't see really, I mean, I think he has some fond memories of communist times. I mean, famously, it's been reported that with the fall of the wall, he was in Dresden, and there were, mass protests in Dresden as well about, getting rid of communism and the Soviet, the KGB office there in Dresden. They were surrounded, and this is where he first became fearful of crowds, and continued to be fearful of crowds, whether it was colored revolutions in Ukraine or Georgia, or protests after the Duma elections and the presidential elections in 2011 and 2012 that he blamed on Hillary Clinton. So there is something to be said for that, but I don't think he's a communist. He likes the support of the Communist Party of Russia, which falls in line pretty much with him and with United Russia, which is the main political party, which Putin always famously says, "I'm not a member of United Russia. I stand above politics." All right, we'll go over here. I can't even remember what all stand. Mission, enemy, time, terrain, weather, something like that, right?
Yeah, and then the last one being civilian considerations. So I'm asking about each setting up a puppet regime and all things along those lines require a strong amount of civilian cooperation, which of course certain Western resources we talk about possibly supporting insurgency. Not trying to get too ahead of our time, my question was, do you think that total war in Ukraine is possible with Russia, or do you think they'll try and hold back in order to ensure civilian cooperation?
Yeah, so the question is, if Russia does invade, will they take into account civilian casualties? As part of their calculus for taking the country, because there's a lot of civilian casualties, there might not be so warm feelings to be absorbed back into Russia. Right? So that's the question here. Does this affect some of the goals? What might occur in Ukraine? It is possible. I think that, I hate to say it. Time will tell here. It's so hard to predict what Putin will do. And everything that I've said here today could be just garbage in 10 minutes, depending on what happens, right? So we have to take that into account. I would hope that the Russian military takes into account minimizing collateral damage. But let's look at their history recently. This army that they've gathered around Ukraine is battle-hardened from Syria, and they certainly didn't seem to care about who they killed there. Now, it could be different with Ukrainian brothers, maybe, but ask Ukrainians who have been held and tortured in eastern Ukraine. There's still 241 Ukrainians held by the Russians in eastern Ukraine right now. Stories coming out about how terribly they've been treated and tortured. So do they really care about human rights? Do they care about their damages? I would say the proof is in the pudding. Once again, let's trust what happens. But yeah, I would be very concerned about urban warfare. I would be concerned about artillery strikes. Artillery doesn't care who it kills. Missiles don't care who they kill. Airstrikes don't care who they kill. I mean, we've seen this. Look at how careful the United States has been in Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting a war in those countries where there's been no peer competitor like the Russians. And we've been able to target terrorists or target, enemy forces, and yet we still kill civilians. I would probably hazard a guess the Russians aren't going to do that. Yes.
What about a little bit with regards to China and the countries in the president? I'm curious how much of our concern right now for the situation comes out of the desire for commodities.
Right. So the question is with the China card here, is this about a Western attempt to curb imperialism or the other way around? Did I get it right?
U.S. foreign policy and foreign advisement. Are we concerned about trying to stop imperialist actions worldwide by any sort of
right? So is this part of a larger foreign policy gained by the United States to to try and prevent what's happening in Ukraine because of this creeping imperialism, or what I would call attempted extending of authoritarian type of rule from China, or Russia. Imperialism has such a kind of a different aspect to it. I know I've used the term empire, so that's my own fault here. Yeah, I mean, I certainly see this. This is, if you look at it from a much higher point of view, I would say that the United States desperately wants to hold on to this rules-based international order that we've constructed along with our friends and allies since the end of World War II and in the post-Cold War era. Who is it going to benefit if it is not done? Exactly authoritarian regimes like we see in China and in Russia, or perhaps in Iran or in North Korea or other countries around the world. So yeah, it's a challenge that's been laid down, no doubt about it. Yeah, I would see it as part of that. Now, is it that well defined in what people in the 7th floor in the State Department and the policy planning folks, are they thinking about that? Yeah, I think there are a lot of smart people. I think there are a lot of smart people in the National Security Council who are probably thinking about this as well. But are we going to translate it into a clear policy? That's always the issue. You know, it's nice to be able to have a George Kennan in February 1946 to be able to write the long telegram, later published as the article by X in July 1947 about containing the Soviet Union, containing Soviet expansionism, and having such a clear goal. I don't know if we have such a clear goal as this. That is going to be the challenge for the Biden administration and whoever comes after. Jackie, and then we'll go back online. We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes. Yep, go ahead, Jackie. Well, yeah, so the question is, you know, we've seen some of the reactions by NATO member countries like France and Germany. What about other members? What about other countries? I would like to think that NATO is more or less united in what's going to happen, with some exceptions. You know, the Germany card, what's going on with Germany? How worried are they going to be about their energy resources? Is that going to be a problem here? I think at the end of the day, the Germans are on board, but they would really like to have that card. Can we still please get the Russian gas, even if all of this happens? And so I'm sure they're trying to work that kind of thing. France, I think, is on board. I mean, the issue with France is always France wants to be independent, right? They want to have an independent European security, away, you know, separate from NATO. And this has always been a particular problem with France in this. I mean, France is an ally and will be an ally and is a good ally. But does that divide up NATO as well? You know, would there be a separate French response to Russian aggression? That's what we have to be careful of. With NATO in place, this should be a NATO action. As far as other countries in Europe, I mean, I think that any country of the former Warsaw Pact, 100,000% with NATO and the United States on this. Don't let anybody kid you. Any of the former Warsaw Pact countries, the celebration was real with the end of communism. You know, they were quite happy to see the Russians leave. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. And they never, ever want to be subjugated like that again. Did I talk about Poland? Did I make a comment about Poland earlier? I think maybe it was with someone else. Let me pick on Poland here for a minute. Poland was violently torn up in 1939 by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement or Pact. You know, officially, this was the Nazi-Soviet agreement not to attack each other for a number of years. The secret protocol of that was we're going to divide up Poland, and Poland will cease to exist. Poland is never going to allow that to happen again without a fight. Poland has a real army. They are real members of NATO. They have real armored divisions. They have real air force. They've been to Iraq. They've been to Afghanistan. They've taken real casualties. This is a kind of country that, despite some democratic backsliding, along with Hungary, but Poland, no doubt about it, they are not going to go down without a fight ever again. They love the fact that the United States is their ally. They love the fact that they are part of the nuclear umbrella that we provide through NATO. And so that's something to remember about those buffer states in between. But at the same time, Poland doesn't want to invade Russia. That would be stupid. They can't do it. So again, I would go back to this argument. NATO is exporting security to Russia's border. It's not a threat. But my inner Russian in me says, I still don't like that. There's maybe a better way to do this. There are some legitimate concerns. Why does NATO still exist? Why was NATO created in 1949? To contain Soviet expansionism. That occurred. Why is it still there? It's worth a debate that we don't have time to debate. Chris, did you have any more questions online? We've got about 5 minutes, so why don't we do the rest of our questions online, and then we'll wrap it up right at 4:30.
So this question is from Megan. Hi, Professor Andrew, and also to listen to you again. Question: do you believe there's a correlation to Russia's increased pressure on Ukraine with the U.S. military that is delivered at increased readiness to the Afghan settlement mission? That's the first part of the question. I'll get to the second.
Okay, so the question is this kind of, I think, goes to the why now type of aspect. You know, this the weakening of the U.S. military or as a result of the Afghan withdrawal. Is this also one of the catalysts for what's happening with Ukraine? Did I understand it correctly, Chris?
The Afghan settlement mission has increased U.S. readiness.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so there's a distraction of the Afghan resettlement mission by the U.S. military and others provided an opportunity, essentially, for Russia to do this. I would say yes. I would be less concerned about the distraction of the entire military to be able to do this. The United States is quite capable of responding to Europe. It might take a little while. If we were to truly move large numbers of forces back to Europe, armored formations, for instance, which I love using that term. But I would say I would go back to my comments on this. I think this helps answer the why now question. And certainly, I would think in less to do with Afghan resettlement, but more to do with the perceived humiliation of the United States and its withdrawal from Afghanistan. This is a perfect time to stick it to the Americans when they're still trying to recover from that. Yep. Right. So if the worst happens, so the question is, if the worst happens in Ukraine and it's invaded, will there be a similar resettlement program into the United States? Well, I don't know. I would certainly hope so. That would be a question to ask of Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and the President. I think there would be a lot of sympathy for that. I think many would probably not want to go that far. They would probably want to go into Europe at this point. Poland has certainly seemed that it's been very willing to resettle folks from Ukraine, at least temporarily. I would like to think that the United States would open up its doors like it did to Afghan, but it's a different situation. We have to remember that. We are not in Ukraine. We're not fighting an insurgency in Ukraine. You know, we with the Afghanistan withdrawal and the evacuation of 100,000 plus Afghans, we have an obligation to help those Afghans who helped us. So perhaps there's not as much of an obligation on the part of the United States to help Ukrainians, but I would hope that we would do that. By the way, let's not count Ukraine out. I think Ukraine's going to stand up for itself. Ukraine doesn't want American troops there, by the way. We don't want American troops here. That's going to muddle the situation. Give us weapons. Let us defend ourselves, and we'll be able to take care of ourselves. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to jump on that a little bit because that Ukraine army today is not an army in
2014.
What about Russian army? If we get past like the battle-hardened professionals who are in Syria, and we look at all those guys who are one-year conscripts, and who are then in the reserve, how well could they stand in if this becomes a really protracted fight?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So the question is how well, if Russia does go into Ukraine and they do need to call up reserves and people who are conscripts before, not contracted soldiers, as they call them, we call professional soldiers, how well would they stand up? I think that's a good question. I don't know precisely, of course, but what I would tell you is we saw what happened to conscripts in Chechnya. They were murdered. I mean, just terribly outclassed by Chechen rebels, Chechen fighters who are well schooled in insurgency tactics. I think that that would be a concern for Russia. I mean, we could be approaching an Afghanistan moment for the Soviet Union. I don't think it's out of the realm to say if Russia were to truly attack Ukraine and get embroiled in an insurgency there, it could spell the end of the Russian government as we know it, just as it did with the Soviet Union. So yeah, I think it would be a problem if we had conscripts into Ukraine and not knowing what they're doing. But I do know that I don't know for sure, but I'm fairly certain, based on the reports I've read about the military forces that are now stationed around Ukraine, these are professionals, and they're going to do a good job at what they do. I think we're at time here, Chris. Was there a burning question, or shall we go ahead and wrap it up? All right. Well, I think we've answered a variety of questions. We are at the end of the time here. Let me just conclude by making a few remarks. First of all, thank you very much for your attention. I want to reiterate that I don't pretend to understand Russia or what Russia is going to do. I feel I have a little bit of experience with Russia, and I've made it my lifelong obsession, my love affair, as I would say, with the Soviet Union and Russia, to understand it better, and to think, can we actually talk to Russians as Americans and maybe get rid of this Cold War thing, which we did. And it's really too bad that we have not been able to take advantage of those great times in the late 80s and early 90s and capitalize on a much better relationship. I won't go into this, but I will at this last slide. What we haven't discussed really, what's the goal of the Biden administration? European actions, are they really in sync with us? Is there a face-saving off-ramp for Putin here to get what he wants without a war? Indeed, how does this end? Okay, so take those questions with you as we finish. And again, thank you for your attention. Those of you who came here in person and all of you online, thanks for coming. And this topic, I'm sure, will be in the news for quite some time. Last thought, for those of you who pray and those of you who don't, please give your prayers and thoughts to a peaceful solution to what's happening in Ukraine and for anyone who gets caught in the crossfire. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.